Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. Today is Friday, which means it's a philosophical day, and I'm joined by my co-host, Duncan Palamourdas. Duncan, how you doing, sir?
Good. Very well. I just realized I have this cable, and I was like, what is happening on my shirt? Whereas like it feels like it's coming from the ether here. So for those of you who uh
Are you
so
sure it's not just a tail?
maybe it's my tail, it's
You are Greek. Maybe Greek people just have very skinny tails. I don't know.
that's that's actually, yeah, very possible. Very possible. So but I don't seem to be able to resolve this cable situation. But anyway, I'm doing really well. How about yourself? Brad, how's life?
Can't complain. About to go on a retreat with a bunch of my wolves for a few days, so pretty pumped about that. Also going to probably play another poker tournament. I think I may have forgotten how painful the last one was, and so
I'm sorry for you. Yeah.
I I feel excited, which just makes me feel sad about how short-sighted I am. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, it's a cycle of tournaments, right? I mean, it's like, oh, I'm so pumped about this tournament, and then why did I play this tournament again? And then I'm so pumped with this next tournament. Why did I
Yeah,
play
I'm like,
tournament?
I'm super pumped until I get dealt the first hand. And
Right.
I'm like, wait, oh my God, how did this happen again?
They lured me.
Yeah, I
Back
fell into
again.
this trap again. What
Yeah,
is wrong with me?
I know.
Um, what's on what's on the agenda today?
So today we're thinking about exploring the idea of going broke in poker, the dangers of going broke, the dangers of busting our bankroll, and how we can avoid it. Is it inevitable? Things like that. We're going to try to figure out what we
Sure,
can do.
sure. Where do you want to
So
start at?
yeah, so here's the, I guess, one question to ask is, how do we define going broke, really? Like, what does it mean to go broke?
So like my personal definition would be that you're out of action. Like that to me is like you're broke. You have no people, you have no like potential backers, you have no friends that can provide you with liquidity. Basically, you're
Mm-hmm.
just out of the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you just can't play poker. And the reason why I would say that instead of like bank account zero, I think that
Mm-hmm.
like that's such a strange thing because like you can own a house and be in
Mm-hmm.
debt, and like how do you quantify exactly like what
Right.
zero is there? But for me, like I come up through the Mike Caro school of thought,
Mm-hmm.
where like the person that makes their money through printing things, a poker player's resource that we use is money.
Right.
And when we are not able to get in action, that means that we're broke. I mean, that means that like we've lost our job, we are unemployed. I guess that's another way of putting it, like going unemployed, basically.
Right. So would you say it's similar to a company that cannot borrow anymore, right? I mean, like a company that is a bankrupt and it's like there's nothing we can do. We have to stop the borrowing. The banks will not lend us any money, so basically it's game over for us. So we have to file for Chapter 11 or something.
Yeah, got to figure out something else to do with our lives, basically.
Got it. So you reminded me of something, and I want to ask you what you think of this, because I have a friend of mine. He's like in his 60s, old school gambler, very successful, very successful. And usually when I do my poker classes, one of the first things that I ask people is the following question. If somebody offered you, $200 on a coin flip, but you would only have to risk, let's say, 100, meaning that they were giving you basically 2-1 on a fair coin flip, right? And so if you lose the coin flip, you lose $100. If you win the coin flip, they pay you 300, so you win $200. Would you take the coin flip? And then most people will say yes. But then I ask them the following question: if somebody gave you 2-1 on your entire net worth on a coin flip, would you take the flip? So I want to ask you two questions. Number one, would you take the flip on your entire net worth? Two to
No,
one.
there's no chance.
No chance. Okay. And you want to elaborate on that first?
I know that I can leverage the resources that I have to more than 2 to 1
Mhm.
over a specific period of time. And also, that would most likely lead to an inevitable instant divorce.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. I love that answer. And it's actually like um for those of you who basically play tournament, you can understand that much better if you have ICM considerations, right? Not every dollar is worth the same amount, right? So as our first dollar is way more valuable than our last dollar, right? I mean, there are diminishing returns when it comes to money. So I would agree. I would agree with you with 100%. And I actually thought that the answer is for most people obvious, right?
It
Until
seems
yeah,
pretty
go ahead.
obvious, yeah.
It seems pretty
But-
obvious, right? So I thought, right? That's why I'm saying that there's no
well,
easy answers.
I would say like the time to do it would probably be when you're young and have, you know, uh basically alternative means of like getting shelter, and you can get a job and like save up the money that you just burned. But
Mhm.
I think it's like has to be relatively lowish risk, 10K to 20K. Okay, maybe if 20K provides more utility, and your hourly rate like doubles because you can play like 2 times stakes or something like that. Whereas you can also just spend 6 months rebuilding that 10K and saving it while living with mom and dad.
Mhm.
Maybe that's like a worthy risk to take, right? But yeah, other than that, I think that that's a little crazy to me.
That's very interesting, and I need to actually come back to this because I really want to ask you that when you think it's okay to go bankrupt or go broke, because that's one of the questions that I wanted to ask.
Hmm.
But the second part of the previous question is that this friend of mine, right, mid his 60s, incredible successful gambler, he told me, you know what, Duncan, I will take the coin flip uh, uh, immediately, and the reason for that is that I know so many people in the industry. I have such an extended credit. I can rebuild my entire fortune. And this is a guy who's a multimillionaire, by the way. He's like very wealthy. And what do you think about that? Do you think he's telling the truth? Do you think he's like,
I think
if
he's
there's
telling the truth.
okay?
I think he's bored.
He's my
Really, like it's just like some kind of challenge, right? Where it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I have to rebuild everything. I think there's some
Right.
like romantic view of that, like in general, and maybe starting over and burning things down and being like, oh, can I do it again? Can I
Yeah.
rebuild it? Like maybe that's just a challenge that like a specific type of person wants to undertake as they get a little bit later in life. I mean, I could definitely see the allure of it.
Mhm. But you don't think it's a value bet, right? I mean, you don't think he's like, oh, I'm getting 2 to 1, and that's why I'm doing it.
Probably not. No.
Probably okay.
Because
So
the
you
same thing applies, right? Like
okay.
if having 2x the liquidity is that valuable and you can also borrow right now because of your contacts, then you could just borrow to get the extra liquidity without going broke, right? So to me, like it doesn't really make sense. But I mean, from like the romantic viewpoint, I think it probably makes some sense.
Right. No, that's a good point. Because I should probably add that this person is very much driven by numbers. He's not. I wouldn't call him necessarily the romantic person, but maybe that's the psychological reason why he did that. So it's actually
The
interesting because
challenge, man, like
the challenge, right?
the
Yeah.
challenge is, the mission, the quest, right? There's
Mhm.
something alluring about the quest, in my opinion.
I would agree. I think it's actually interesting, and I've never thought of that before. That he could just easily be bored, right, and instinctively say, you know what, on the positive side, okay, 2 to 1. That's I'm getting like great odds, and then on the negative side, it's not so bad because there's challenge, so he can use both of these things. But you mentioned something earlier that I really wanted to come back to. You mentioned that maybe there's right time when people can go broke. Try to dissect this a little bit for us. I mean, you mentioned like people at the beginning when they're living with the parents, and when is it the right time for people to go broke, or when is some time when it's not
Yeah.
as hurtful as
It's a good question. And I don't know the exact answer, but to me, it's probably a math problem of like, how much does I guess you would turn your like 10K into like 30K, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you had a 10K roll. How much does that extra 20K earn you based on like what doors does it open? And then also like how long does it take you to rebuild the 10K? And then like figure out the math of that, right? So like essentially if it takes you say 6 months to save $10,000 because you're young, you have no expenses, you live with your parents, and you can just get a job and save money. Okay, so you're risking basically 6 months of that. And then on the flip side of that, if you are to basically triple up, and you go from being able to play like 1-2, where your hourly is like $30 or $25 an hour, to 2-5, where your hourly is like 50 or 60 an hour, you play poker about 40 hours a week. So that extra, that basically doubling your hourly rate, is going to be worth, I mean, what is that? Like $1,000 a week. So 26 weeks, that's worth like an extra $26,000. So like that would be the way that I would really think about it, is like if getting that extra 20K ends up that I make 26,000 extra dollars over the next 6 months, which means this flip is, effectively going to be worth like 50K, versus saving up 10K bankroll just through working. But it would just be a math problem. I mean, I guess the other alternative would be how good your credit is, and if there's some kind of opportunity cost of not being able to do something in the near future that it kind of unlocks, which I don't know exactly what that might be, but just imagine, that Hustler live stream where everybody's just sending it in every hand with Helmuth and the influencers, right? Like, oh, well,
Right.
maybe if you like double your net worth or triple your net worth and you're able to like play in that game through a very rare opportunity and you miss out, if you don't, then okay, maybe that makes it worth it too. I'm not sure.
No, this is a very good point. Are there any psychological considerations? Meaning, are we factoring in any negative impact of the potential loss that could impede the way that person could perform in the future? Is it something that we should factor in?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And so there's a podcast episode with Kevin Kelly on the Tim Ferriss show that I listened to 4 or 5 years back, and he did an experiment. I believe it was Kevin Kelly, where when he was young, he spent a year backpacking in Europe and living in hostels and basically just spending. He didn't spend any money. He had like odd jobs in the towns that he was like staying in,
Right.
to basically earn food, and basically he wanted to see what life would be like if he went broke. Right? That was like an approximation of like, well, if I lost everything, this is what a life would be like. And after the year, he realized that it actually wasn't that bad, right? Like that was his realization, was like, I actually had a lot of fun. This wasn't that bad. And that actually removed a lot of the fear of going broke from him. I believe he went on to like start Wired magazine. And I think that these sort of trials and tribulations, while they offer short-term extreme discomfort when you're young, I also think that they help build resiliency and kind of give you a taste of like what a worst case scenario would look like. And I think there's a lot of value in that. So I actually think that like the negative impact of going broke when you're young like that actually can have positive EV downstream.
And incidentally, for the listener, I believe that's what Tim Ferriss himself calls what's the worst that can happen, right? I mean, it's one of the first things that he's talking about in his book, The 4-Hour Work Week, for those of you who've read it. And it's basically worst case scenario, right? And somebody tried it. A quick question for you. Do you think this is a universal property? Meaning, do you think that this is something that would happen to any individual who took the same action? Or do you think that might be specific to that specific individual?
I think that it's not universal. And I also think that if it filters out people from the lifestyle of poker, that's ultimately a good thing for them, because they will inevitably have to deal, maybe not with something that extreme, but something similar in their career of like having giant losses and feeling really emotionally impacted. And I mean, if they can't recover mentally, if they just can't move forward, then poker's probably not the right path for them anyway. And so like I think it's actually a good filter for those types of people, because I mean, there's other ways to go about making money and working your way through the world. And the reality is poker is just not for everybody. There are some people that just cannot handle the emotional swings of the game. And
Absolutely.
if they get filtered out and that saves them decades of thinking that they could make a run at playing poker professionally, ultimately, I think that's a gain for them.
And do you think that is going broke one of the best ways for them to figure it out, or do you think there is alternative, less painful ways to figure that out?
I think there's alternative ways. I don't think we necessarily need to be masochistic about it. Like, you know, I tell people all the time when they're thinking about embarking on a poker career, right? Like in poker, like in the instance of, say, your significant other doesn't look favorably upon the path of a professional poker player, right? I think that that's a situation where humans most likely drawing dead. And the reality is, without that outside pressure, poker is hard enough when everything's going perfectly. Right? So
Very
like,
true.
you know, we don't need anything extra to make us feel pain. We're going to feel pain. Like you are going to feel lots of pain. You're going to suffer. So I don't think it's like necessary to just like have to destroy someone's bankroll and their entire net worth in order to feel that pain. It's a very natural consequence of pursuing the game.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the word suffer here, and I just and again, I use hyperboles all the time, but do you make a distinction between the actual act of pain and the interpretation of that pain, which can be translated into suffering? Do you make a distinction between the word pain and suffering? Do you think that there can be pain without suffering?
What a good question. Do I think there can be pain without suffering? I don't think so in the poker sense. I think that the pain is like losing that pot. So like basically if we go back to the original question, right, of like the 3-1, the pain would be losing the flip and your entire net worth. And then the suffering would be the rumination after that over the next 6 months while you're having to rebuild. That would be the suffering aspect of it. And I think that as poker players, at least higher level poker players, there is always suffering because we play a game where it's impossible to be perfect. And that inability to be perfect, even when you win, creates suffering, even when you have a winning session, because you're still going to think about how you played a set. Did I maximize value? Should I have made the fold on the river when I thought they were under bluffing? Doesn't matter whether, you know, you could again win 5 buy-ins and you're still going to suffer at the end of it. I think that suffering is just like, I think it's one of the catalysts to growing as a poker player. The rumination, the suffering, just part of the game.
Right. And again, I mean, of course, I guess it would depend how would we define those words.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the pain is like when you make a value bet and villain snaps and shows you like one of the better hands they have, right? And you recognize, holy shit, I just left a lot of money on the table. The suffering is when you're thinking about that.
Correct.
For the next 30 minutes, or when you cash your chips out and you're thinking about it on the way home, like, fuck, I won 4K, but I should have won 8K.
Right. That's how I would define it perfectly. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's people like Tommy Angelo comes to mind, right? Who is my understanding of his work is he's made it his life goal to accept pain at the poker table and eliminate suffering as much as possible, exactly in the form you just described it. Like the idea of we want to think of the past only as much as is necessary, no more than that, right? I mean, only as it can help us to improve our future decisions, but no more than that. Like, and do you think not on an idealistic level, but at a practical level, do you think that this is possible? Do you think it's possible for people to reach a state of, I guess we can call it poker enlightenment, to use, Tommy Angelo's terms, where we think about poker and only up to the point that it benefits our future actions, but no.
I think it's a great ideal to strive towards. I have never met anyone in this space that has reached that ideal, no matter who they are.
Have you met anybody who came close?
It depends. It depends on the pressure, right? I
Mhm.
think that there, at some level, the pressure is enough to affect most anybody. So maybe maybe somebody that's not trying to find their limits,
Mhm.
that is happy playing 1-2 forever, maybe that person's gonna not suffer so much. But anybody that's really pushing to see what they're made of, to see how far they can go, I think that they will naturally suffer because the pressure is a natural component to the suffering. So I mean, the only times, there are times, yeah, lots of times where people will reach that level of enlightenment, but when they kick up the stakes 2x, 4x, 5x, at some point they're going to suffer, in my opinion. It's just really, 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 really difficult to eliminate that aspect of it. There's nobody that I know of that can do that at the highest stakes they're capable of playing.
You see that what you're saying here is actually incredibly interesting, because you mentioned that essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, that as the stakes go higher, so does the probability, or the actual suffering goes up as well. So would you say that in that case, going broke is peak suffering?
I don't think so.
Where would you find peak suffering? I mean, of course, it would depend on the different individual, but how would you envision it?
Peak
Yes.
suffering,
Yeah.
imagine a circle where
Mhm.
the edge of it is your comfort zone and you're
Mhm.
actively trying to push and expand that comfort zone. Peak suffering is anybody that lives at the edge of that circle.
And going broke is not necessarily that. I mean, it could be correlated, but it's not necessarily
No,
the same thing, right?
it's just a consequence of always kind of living on the edge, always seeing how far you can push it, always being in a state where you're filled with anxiety, you're filled with, you can feel the pressure tangibly on a day in, day out basis. I think that when you're in that state of being, um, and everything matters, every decision matters one way or the other, that's going and I guess peak suffering, I would just imagine where the highest ratio of your time spent doing something,
Mhm.
and then how much you're suffering, basically the time spent doing something with suffering. And going broke, actually, I think in some cases, in a lot of cases, and this is something I've never thought about before, but I think going broke in a lot of cases actually can end suffering, in that sense.
Talk to us a little bit more about that, like how exactly, give us an example, because so far what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, so sometimes going broke is a consequence of peak suffering, but it doesn't necessarily cause it.
So imagine a very high level poker player, and this
Mhm.
is an actual story. I'll leave the names blank.
Sure. Let's call them
And
Alex.
yeah, an acquaintance of mine. It's not really Alex and Bobby. It's
Okay.
it's like two of the best poker players on the planet,
Okay.
bar none, playing nosebleeds,
Okay.
right? Um, Player A is
Alex.
playing against player B. Yeah, we'll say Alex is playing against Bobby. Since that's I think we're contractually obligated to use those in our metaphors or our stories. So Alex is playing Bobby, and Bobby just wants to play poker, and Bobby has, say, 50K in his account, right? And Bobby stays awake playing Alex for 3 days straight. And when Bobby has 50K in wins, he wants to split and start a new table, right? And Bobby's playing poorly, right? And Alex eventually beats Bobby and cleans him out.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby, because has no more money in account, has been awake 3 days, can now sleep. That's what I mean by somebody can go broke and it can actually end their suffering. They can remove themselves from that state of being and just rest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's again, that's a true story about
Sure.
a couple of nosebleed guys where one guy just does not want to quit. He basically would go broke. He would bust his account out, and the other player genuinely believed that he would bust his account out so that he could just go to sleep, which there's some kind of addiction in that story. But either way, I think that it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that busting his account ended his suffering, at least for that day.
Right. So, and following up on the at least for that day, how do we put short-term suffering and long-term suffering into the equation? And again, we may be getting a little bit out of topic, but it is related to going broke, because what I'm trying to gauge is what are the consequences, or what does going broke tell us about our current state of the game? That's why I'm asking those questions, right? I mean, what is the relation to short-term suffering, long-term suffering, and what can we learn from it?
I have to reject the question.
Okay.
Because I don't think any of us are smart enough to know how the short term affects long term suffering.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you're not rejecting it. You're actually answering it very well. You're basically saying this is not a question we can ever be able to figure out.
Right, because
yeah, mm-hmm. No, that's great.
I think in a lot of people's lives, my life especially, when things are dark or have been dark,
mm-hmm.
oftentimes I can reflect and recognize that that was what I needed in the moment, mm-hmm. and I'm very grateful for that experience.
I think you mentioned a very good example of that, if I remember correctly. Maybe you can remind the listener. I think we're talking about slot machines, and you have a very interesting experience that you shared with us in the past, and that was very similar to that. Like, I don't know how much you want to share with the listener. But
I mean, I basically was an idiot at 22 years old and hit a slot jackpot because why not, while I was waiting for my game, and then kind of had a minor slot addiction for a few months and lost most of my bankroll putting the Benjamins in the slot machine for one pull. And I mean, I think that lesson is lesser, I guess, than it is a valuable lesson that I learned. But I mean, like Black Friday, right? Black Friday changed my life. It changed lots of people's lives.
Absolutely.
Some people absolutely it changed for the worse. Mine, it changed absolutely for the better. I had to evaluate my life, mm-hmm. and that gave me an opportunity to evaluate everything that was going on. And my life dramatically changed from that day moving forward. Initially for the worst, just because of the obvious Black Friday reasons, and very quickly for the better for all time, right? And so I just think that we're really bad at gauging the mm-hmm. downstream suffering from the short term, because we can't see the future and we don't know what the future may entail. So to me, I just think it's an impossible question to answer, because we don't know. Maybe going broke is the best thing that needs to happen to that person in that moment, and it leads them to joy, fulfillment, happiness downstream. And so hard to know.
Absolutely. And what you're basically saying here, I mean, you remind me of, I have to admit, I need to give a little bit of introduction to what I'm going to say next. I don't understand spirituality very well myself. So this is something that I'm trying to understand, because, other people, many people are big on it, but I don't understand it very well myself. So I'm trying to investigate and read as much as I can. So there's a gentleman by the name of...
so many thoughts. Why didn't we do a podcast on spirituality?
For sure.
That would be a great one.
Absolutely. I'll put it down. You know what? Well, I'm going to professional here. So let's going to go ahead and make a note right now so that we don't forget.
Yeah.
So we're going to self-outsource it for my future self to see that. So spirituality, very good. I added on the list. Mm-hmm. So there's a gentleman by the name of Eckhart Tolle. Some people may know him. He wrote a book, The Power of Now. For some people, this is just woohoo mambo jumbo. For some people, it's one of the greatest books that were ever written. But one of the things that I found fascinating, I don't know if it's true or not, but he's basically describing in the book how he reached absolute rock bottom before he got what he would consider enlightenment. Again, too many big words. I mean, we need to define all those things. But basically, the gist of it is the following. He came into the verge of basically taking his own life. And then after he reached that point, that super dark point in his life, he was like around 29 at the time, I believe, he basically came to a realization. The realization is relevant at this point. I'm not going to mention it, but he came to a certain realization that caused him to follow this super dark situation with extreme euphoria. So to your point, who knows what can actually trigger and stop suffering? We never know. Like, those suicidal thoughts, and I might as well, since I mentioned it, what he says in the book is that he said to himself, I can no longer live with myself, right? That's what the thought that he asked himself. And then he realized, well, who is I and who is myself? Like, am I two people? Like, that was his big realization, which a lot of people understand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they understand that intuitively, right?
Intuitively, right? And that was a big epiphany for him, because he realized that there's a difference between the I and himself, and he can distance one from the other. And anyway,
the very easy way to think about it for the listener is, you say like, my hand hurts, like my hand. And so who's the me in that statement? Like, who's the me? And, cut your hand off and bury it out in the desert. Is it still your hand? Right. Like, and then again, like, who's the me in this context, right? My hand hurts, which means you're something like outside of your hand, effectively. It's what you're saying.
In philosophy, they call that Theseus sheep. Exactly. You have the sheep of Theseus, and you remove one part and you replace one part, then you replace another part. Eventually, you replace all those parts. Is it still? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's like the ship of Theseus is basically the famous ship of Theseus in Greece, Greek mythology, is on display at a museum, and the wood rots out over time, and you have to replace a plank. And then after 1,000 years, every plank in the whole ship has been replaced. So like, at what is it still the ship of Theseus, because none of the planks are original? And at what point did it change from the ship of Theseus to something else entirely, right? I think that's the thought problem there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's an excellent question, which we can add that to a future discussion as well. Like,
why not? Yeah, using this for like topic discovery.
Topic discovery. But back to the original question, right? I mean, and to your point, so the point that you made, the last point that you made, very important, is that who knows what dark moment or dark thought can actually be a trigger to end our suffering, which brings me to my next question. So it is a very complicated thing. How does, let's say, a poker player or an amateur intermediate player or a experienced player should think of going broke, since it's such a complicated subject? And how should they decide where they fall on that spectrum, if going broke can be helpful or not? And if they cannot predict that, how should they approach the entire concept, the entire risk of potentially going broke? And how should they decide whether to avoid it or not? What are some inner thoughts they should ask themselves, and some practical heuristics they can come up with, so that they decide how to live with that inevitable danger that may show up at some point?
Yeah, so longtime listeners of the podcast will probably be able to predict what I'm going to say, and that is, if you can rebuild it, like, is this rebuildable in a short period of time? If it is, then your bankroll doesn't need to be protected as much, right? You can replace $1,000 most likely, in a shortish amount of time, it's much more difficult to replace $100,000 or $500,000 or $1 million. So basically, the bigger your bankroll is, the more protective you need to be of it, and the more pain it's going to be for you to go broke. And the smaller your bankroll is, the less protective you need to be of it, and the less pain you feel with going broke. Because again, it's a very replaceable thing. And that's sort of like how I would frame things and how I think about things. I know that like lots of people on the listeners of the podcast, lots of people in the village want to go through the whole poker. They want to go the way that like people on message boards and like people say, like through the micros all the way up. And that to me has always been like the most the just the most miserable thought of my existence. Like
Right.
you don't need to earn your way up. You don't need to beat 5 and L so you can beat 10 and L so you can beat 25 so you can beat 50.
Right.
That to me has just always been the silliest notion.
Mhm.
And actually Coach Shu in the village, CPG private coach Shu, he made his way up from the micros. Like he went through all of the stakes one by one, and is the first to say that it was just a colossal waste of time. And like, why on earth did he think that he needed to do that? So, I mean, to me, it's like study, learn, grow, buy courses, get coaching, whatever it is. Like you can make a larger investment. Say you get coaching for like $200 and your bankroll's 1,000. That's 20% of your bankroll, right?
Mhm.
I think that like that's probably okay because you can replace that 200, right? Now, if you have $100,000 bankroll and you get a coaching session for $20,000, that may be worse because it's a lot more difficult to replace that 20,000. So like, just think of it in those terms of like, what do I lose? What's the downside? You know, the whole story of Kevin Kelly, like what does going broke look like in the context of your life? And if it's like, oh, it's just like 2 years ago, when I lived with my mom and I was going to high school, then maybe that's not significant downside because life probably wouldn't be so bad in that case.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so to summarize, is it replaceable, right? I mean, that's the important question,
Yeah.
the heuristic question people should ask themselves. Is it replaceable? Which actually naturally brings us to two more questions. You know, we're never going to run out of questions because these are interesting things. So one question I have is, what inquiries, self-inquiries people have to make to themselves to decide whether something is replaceable or not, right? I mean, what are some important things? And you already alluded to that earlier, some, for example, mathematical calculations. And in particular, should people also have psychological considerations, which was something that I asked you earlier? And what are, if not, what are some questions? And then I'll ask you the second question later. What are some things that they need to ask themselves? What is the checklist to decide if something is replaceable or not, practically speaking?
Yeah, I mean, can you get a job? What skill set do you have? Do you have liquidity outside of your own bankroll in the form of your network? What sort of education do you have? What sort of relationships do you have in the workforce that you could leverage? Mike McD, he took a job with Kanish after he went broke, right? So he mined his network and leveraged that so that he could get a gig after he lost his 3 stacks of high society. So that to me is like, if you're writing a checklist down, is like, really, I think I'm a big fan of like the visualization process and just visualizing your life. If you were to go broke, what would it look like? And just write that out and think about that. And then you can see the downside just through that simple exercise. And in some cases, the downside is not so bad. And so like, okay, so if the downside's not so bad, then maybe the risk is okay.
Very good. And I would only add to that, as if you try to find how your life would look like, you can try to also incorporate emotional state, because that could potentially be it's a form of cost, right? I mean, depending on what the person is.
Sure.
Excellent.
I think too, like there's a time before you had your bankroll, right? That's probably a good barometer to how your life would be if you went broke, because
that's a good heuristic.
That's
Very
just
good.
exactly back to that, right?
Absolutely. No, this is excellent. And I guess the second natural question to is it replaceable is, so what would you suggest people consider with, if the answer is negative, no, this is not replaceable? So how do they position themselves to protect, essentially to protect them from themselves, from losing that irreplaceable amount, whatever that may be?
I mean, it depends on what you want to do, right? Like what's the aim, what's the risk that, or the opportunity that you might be taking that would jeopardize
So is
said bankroll.
is it dependent on what you want to do? Like, does that, like, let's say that we have decided for specific purposes that amount is irreplaceable. So
Sure.
so let's say that we come to the conclusion, just to simplify the example, that we don't want to lose that, whatever that is, X amount, because all hell is going to break loose. That's our. So what would be the next step to avoid losing that? Like, how can we?
More math. I know this is a philosophical podcast, but to me, math is king here, right? Like, look
No,
at
I mean,
the.
like, okay, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, if you're going to protect your bankroll, then like look at the downside, look at the risk of ruin, see what stakes you can play, and then play those stakes if it's irreplaceable, right? Other ways or things that you could do is to offset the risk is sell action.
Okay.
Look at your network and try to minimize the risk or reduce the risk.
What I'm getting with this, and I think I'm not specific enough. What I'm getting with this is that there let's give an amount. Let's say that for some people, risking $100,000 or whatever, like just to give an amount, it doesn't really matter because you mentioned $100,000 earlier.
Sure.
So let's say that somebody decides, I don't want to risk $100,000, but they're in a situation. It may be tempting. They're sitting down at the table. They so happen to have that amount in the casino, in chips, in whatever reason. How do they protect that's what I was getting at. Like, how, what are some rules they can put in place other than just don't do it? Because
so just take a moment and walk to the bathroom and punch yourself right in the face. And don't sit the fuck down. Like that's what you do. You just don't do it. I mean, whatever that thing is that you're tempted to do that could cause you to bust an irreplaceable bankroll, don't fucking do it.
That's very good. So in the hypothetical scenario where that person is willing to risk, let's say 10,000, but not 100,000, but they know that if they sit at the table, there might be a chance to risk 100,000. Would you say that they shouldn't sit at the table at all?
Absolutely, they should not sit at the table because I've seen how that story ends. It always ends the same way. Go to the casino, pit with a degenerate who has like 20K on them, and they go, here, hold my money. Only give me 1,000. Don't give me any money, no matter what I say. Always ends the same way with me saying, fuck you, take your money. That's how it always ends because they just will not let up after that 1,000 is gone. So to me, like, that's just setting yourself up to get destroyed. And so like, just, I wouldn't do it. I think that risk is just intolerable.
I think this is excellent. I think this is a very good advice, that sometimes we gotta, even if we lose a little bit of an opportunity, sometimes when there is risk, and again, I'm paraphrasing what you're saying, I'm trying to generalize it into an actionable suggestion. Even when there's opportunity presenting itself, when the risk and the important risk is really adjacent to that opportunity, maybe it's okay to forego the opportunity as well. Like,
know your humanity.
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
a human being and know how human beings operate. In my experience, maybe I just have like more annoying friends than most people who are like well-intentioned in the moment. But like when that 1,000 is gone and they want to keep going, they're just so annoying that like it just like is intolerable to be around them for like hours and hours and hours, right? And it's just like, it always ends up with me going, here, lose your money if you want, whatever, like that. So yeah, just understand that you're a human being and you lose that 10K and that 10K matters to you and you have 100. Well, guess what's going to happen? It's like gambler's fallacy, right? 10 more, let's go. Oh, 20, nope. 30, 40, 50, then it's all gone. I mean, seen the story. Yeah, just seen the story play out too many times. I know the ending.
Absolutely. No, I think this is an excellent advice, and you and I agree on that 100%. I guess, we can't really talk about going broke without really talking about one of the famous Doyle Branson quotes, right? I think I mentioned that in the very first podcast. I like that quote because we can talk so much about it. He says that no gambler is a true gambler unless they go broke once, at least once in their lives, right? Of course, Doyle Branson lived in different times, but he's also incredibly experienced, and essentially says that any professional poker player has gone broke at least once in their life. First of all, do you agree? And when I say all, let's replace that with almost all, right? Because again, we don't have to be absolute, but would you agree with that statement? And
I would say,
do you have any thoughts?
why is it so romantic to see yourself as a professional gambler? I mean, that's my initial reaction to that quote is like all true professional gamblers go broke at least once in their career.
I don't think I may be losing something in my paraphrasing here. I don't think he mentioned it as a to romanticize gamblers. He most of like.
I think it is though, right?
He's
So? Saying it's a badge of honor.
Okay,
He's
you think it's a badge of honor?
Like,
okay,
yeah, it's like a battle scar, right? It's a war wound that the gamblers convention, they get together once a year and everybody talks about the time that they went broke, and everybody drinks a beer and laughs and has a good time. And I would just say, like, why? Yeah. Why is that necessary? Again, there's enough suffering in this game without forcing yourself to go broke. So like that just seems unnecessary in my opinion.
Absolutely. And for those people who are risk averse, again, like being a poker player, being risk averse, not necessarily very compatible, but sorry, go ahead.
No, just to follow up on that, like, yeah, there's a book that's one of my favorite books. I try to read it every 3 to 4 years, Tuesdays with Maury, about Maury Schwartz. He's being interviewed by Mitch Albom, and he's in stage Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's about end of life. And Maury, there's a story told about Maury where everybody's in the gym. It's a basketball game, and it's home team. So Maury's a college professor, and their team, the fans are shouting, "We're number one! We're number one!" And Maury stands up and says, "What's wrong with being number two?" And that sort of reminds me of that Doyle quote, right? Like, what's wrong with not having that scar? Nothing, right? In my opinion, there's nothing wrong with it.
Absolutely. And someone may say you even, have the benefits of never being broke, right? I mean, you actually have the money to put it in good use, which brings me to, I guess, to my last question, which is it possible? And by possible, I mean, is it reasonably likely for a professional poker player to structure their lives in such a way where if they don't want to, they never have to go broke once in their lives?
Sure. Why not? I mean, you can play the micros and get a job and never go broke. Like,
okay. Is there a non-condescending way?
Like
I love this podcast.
a lot of it hinges on well, you said, that's the answer, right? Like you can easily,
right. No, you're asking philosophically. I'm asking, I love the answer. I just say practically.
Yeah, practically. I mean, I think that always having a network is exceptionally underrated in this space. Relationships matter in the real world. Relationships are paramount. Mentioning Tim Ferriss twice in the same episode, but you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And so like networking, and just putting yourself in a position to where like, okay, like if in a worst case scenario, my risk of ruin is like 3%, if that hits, what's my out after that? I'm going to hit up Kanish and go take the truck and deliver stuff until I'm back in action. So like there are ways to effectively reduce your risk of ruin down to 0%. And the primary way is through networking and connections, and just always doing the best possible job you can to progress, improve, learn, grow, hunger for knowledge, try to execute at a higher level, try to perform at a higher level, find mentors, just all those little things that when people see the links that you go to be a pro, they're happy to invest in you. They're happy to be able to provide you with an opportunity because they know it's going to benefit them in the same way that it benefits you. So like that to me is the best way to reduce your risk of ruin down to effectively zero is by just doing everything in your power to be the best version of yourself and building your networks because you know like there's if something were to happen to me, I could make one phone call and play probably whatever stakes I wanted to play. And like that's a very comforting thought.
That sounds a lot like operating a business, by the way, like the way you're talking about the idea of networking and of having other people helping you in difficult situations, and the way of creating the mathematical formulas you were talking about, like, what is the risk reward? That sounds a lot like operating a business. So
the truth is risk of ruin is probably never zero.
That's right.
Because you have a loved one that in the US with the healthcare system, they get sick, they get cancer, they have medical bills that pile up, and you're effectively broke through nothing that was foreseeable and nothing that was either of you's fault. But the reality is that happened. You may not have ever had a losing year of poker in your entire life and you just went broke, right? What's the solution there, right? Like how do you still generate money? And the solution is you have to look outside of, yourself and talk to somebody else who is in a position to be of assistance through that really difficult time.
I think this is an incredibly important point for the listener, right? I mean, so risk is not eliminatable. It's only mitigatable, right? I mean, we can only mitigate the risk. We cannot eliminate it. And it's a question. And to be fair, when we're talking about going broke, we're trying to frame it under, is there a way to potentially limit exposure? And you already gave a lot of great heuristics, right? I mean, sacrificing an opportunity to avoid a certain risk. Ask yourself, is it replaceable? These are important questions that people can ask themselves.
Yeah, and the networking is just a redundancy, right? It's just a redundancy to protect you.
A fail-safe, which is very good though. Like it can be incredibly helpful.
And it doesn't have to be like manipulative or you know what I mean? It's like it could just be like your best friend that you play poker with all the time that like knows you and trusts you, and like something happens and then they're there, right? They're like there to help, which again, it's mutually beneficial.
It's
so like
reciprocal, right?
Yeah, nobody's getting like taken advantage of in the situation.
Absolutely, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So so some closing thoughts about, like, to put it everything together, right? I mean, to summarize a little bit. So how should and that's going to be some of the things that you already said, but to summarize, how should people in general think of the concept of going broke? Should they spend any time at all thinking about it? And any other thoughts that you didn't get an opportunity to share?
I think I've shared all the thoughts that I've had. How should people think about going broke? I mean, I think that they should just think of it as an event that is an event, that it's not the end of the world. It's not life crashing down. It's just something that happened. And then after that happens, it's a catalyst for something else to happen. And so like understanding what happens after you go broke, I think can remove a lot of the fear out of the act of going broke, because then you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen in this instance. And so, okay, so it happened. You just take the next step.
That's right. Otherwise, you're condemned to play micros for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that's not a fate that I would wish on any listener of the podcast or any human on the face of the planet, to be honest.
Not even your own enemies.
That's too painful for even my own enemies. Get out of the micros, guys. What are you doing?
I'd rather be dead than play the micros.
It's not even a question. I would rather. I can't even. Unspeakable thing. Death would be
relief,
just paradise compared to being stuck in the micros.
Excellent. I love it. No, this is great stuff, man. And And I'm sure like people will have stories to share, which I would really like to hear from people. Like, tell us, have you ever gone broke? This is a question I always wanted to ask on Twitter, but I feel a little bit, I don't want to, some people are sensitive about that stuff, and it might be a little bit of too personal. People may not want to share, but if you have a story you want to share with us, what would be like a good place where people can come and share like they're going broke
Probably
stories?
greatnessvillage.com,
Right.
and the Philosophical Friday channel within Greatness Village that you join automatically, by the way. And you can tag at Duncan or at Coach Brad in that channel, in Greatness Village on Slack.
And we will see it. And, if we really like the question, we may answer with like 3,000 words. So
yeah,
with assist.
You're very generous with the pronoun usage there of we.
No, we're a team. And also, how do people, because we've never mentioned that before, right? Just for the less tech savvy people who've never used Slack before. So what is, how do people sign up for the Greatness Village, like in broad strokes?
Yeah, I mean, you just click the button and then you say sign up through Google, and you have a Gmail account. And if you don't have a Gmail account, you're working on like Hotmail, tweet at Ask the Math Doctor on Twitter for advice. Please don't tweet me. Customer support, troubleshooting, that is not an area I am equipped for. My brain explodes very quickly.
Me neither, but for what it's worth, I welcome everybody's tweets. So again, at CPG podcast and at Ask the Math DR, and also you can find us on YouTube's. We both have YouTube's if you want to see footage.
Yeah, give them your YouTube channel.
Yeah, where Alex beats Bobby, Bobbia. I have to say that every time. Now you made me self-conscious. So yeah, if you want to see like the cable from like I look like a cyborg today. So
good luck never finding Duncan's YouTube channel.
Thank you very much. Very much. This is an excellent search engine optimization. They use me as an example of the example to avoid, right? So, dude, it's been a pleasure as always.
Yes, sir. And, I'll see you next week after my experience playing the multi-table tournament and telling you how terrible it was and why I'll never do it again until the next time. I forget about the suffering.
Exactly. So this is the not rock bottom then. Okay, so we have a while until we hit the rock bottom. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for listening. Likewise, man.